On a raw September morning in 1906, four horses were dragging a black iron cylinder up a frozen-looking hillside in western Montana. It weighed a little over 5,000 pounds. But the strange part was not the cylinder. The strange part was where Elias Kevern wanted it placed. Not on a stone foundation, not on a bed of logs, 14 feet in the air. The cylinder was an old logging locomotive boiler, 15 feet long, 6 feet wide, scarred with rivets and soot. It had been condemned from the Northern Pacific repair yard and sold as scrap. To everyone watching, it looked like a steel coffin. To Elias, it looked like the first warm winter his family might ever have. Below the ramp, a cluster of men from the railway shop stood in their heavy coats, making no effort to hide their disgust. Gideon Vale, the bridge carpenter, narrowed his eyes at the structure waiting above the slope. 12 tamarack posts had been sunk deep into the earth and cross-braced until they looked less like house supports than the legs of a small trestle bridge. Gideon understood load. He understood wind. He understood what happened when men confused cleverness with judgment. "That shell will roll in the first gale," he said. Amos Bell, a county builder with frost-split hands, laughed under his breath. "No, first it will shake, then the legs will rack, then that whole iron barrel will drop like a safe from a roof." A third man muttered what the others were already thinking. "He's putting his wife and children in a hanging stove." Elias heard them. He did not answer. He only lifted one hand, signaled the teamster, and watched the boiler creep another inch up the greased timbers. The horses leaned forward, the pulleys cried, the black cylinder rose toward the cradle above the snow line, and the men below decided, with complete confidence, that Elias Kevern had finally lost his mind. What none of them understood was that Elias was not trying to build a better cabin. He was trying to escape the thing every cabin was built on: the ground. Elias Kevern was not a frontier carpenter. He had not grown up notching pine logs or reading a winter by the way snow settled against a door. He was a Cornish steamfitter from the engine houses near Camborne, a man who had spent half his life around pressure, heat, expansion, and metal that could kill you if you misunderstood it by a quarter inch. His hands knew rivets, they knew gaskets, they knew what happened when heat met cold steel too quickly, and how a thin, hidden gap could matter more than a thick, visible wall. That was the kind of knowledge he carried west with his wife, Mara, and their 2 children, Thomas and Ruth. When they reached the Bitterroot foothills, they did what settlers were supposed to do. They built low, they built solid, they built close to the earth. The cabin had one room, a dirt-chinked stone footing, rough plank floors, peeled lodgepole walls, and a little box stove that glowed red by midnight. The neighbors called it tight. Then the winter of 1905 arrived, and the cabin taught Elias a lesson more brutal than any foreman ever had. This cold did not behave like the wet Atlantic cold he knew from Cornwall. This cold was dry, clean, and almost intelligent. It seemed to enter without needing a crack. It crawled up through the floorboards. It stiffened the blankets along the wall. It turned the inside of the window glass white by dawn, not with a lace of frost, but with a thick blind crust you had to scrape with a spoon. At night, the children slept on a straw mattress between the stove and their parents' bed. Still, Ruth woke crying because her hair had frozen where her breath touched the quilt. One morning, Mara lifted the water pail from the corner and found the surface skinned hard with ice, though the stove had burned all night. Another morning, Elias reached for his leather work gloves, and one thumb cracked open like old bark. But the worst thing was the floor. No matter how much wood he fed the stove, the air above their heads became hot while their feet stayed numb. The cabin had a cruel vertical weather of its own. Heat above, winter below. Mara learned to cook with one foot resting on the stove hearth and the other tucked inside a folded sack. Thomas stopped playing on the floor. The boy stood when he read, shoulders hunched, because sitting down meant letting the cold climb into his bones. By February, Elias understood something his neighbors had accepted as fate. They were not merely heating a room, they were heating the earth beneath it. Every split log he burned sent a little of its warmth downward, into planks, then joists, then stone, then the frozen soil and packed snow that pressed against the foundation like a sleeping animal with endless hunger. The settlers fought it the usual ways. They nailed canvas under the floor. They banked snow against the walls. They threw rugs over the planks until the rugs themselves became cold. They built bigger fires. But a bigger fire only made the ceiling hotter. The floor remained a thief. Elias saw the problem differently because he did not think like a house builder. He thought like a steam man. In a boiler room, a bad connection mattered. A path mattered. A bridge between hot and cold mattered. Cut the path, and the whole machine changed. The ground did not need to be beaten. It needed to be disconnected. That spring, while other men repaired roofs and cut fence rails, Elias walked the railway scrapyard in Missoula with a tape line in his pocket. He ignored the cracked wheels, the rusted springs, and the bent tie plates. He stopped in front of the boiler shell. The firebox was gone. The tubes had been stripped. The steel was ugly, but sound. To the yardmaster, it was dead iron. To Elias, it was a ready-made pressure vessel that no longer needed to hold pressure. A shell that had once survived steam could survive weather. A curve that had once moved heat through steel could now move heat around a family. He paid $38 for it. Then he spent the summer making everyone in the valley certain he had wasted the money. First came the posts. Not spruce, not lodgepole, tamarack. Straight, resinous, slow to rot, and strong enough to serve in wet trestles. Elias chose 12 trunks thicker than a man's thigh and set them in holes dug 7 feet down, below the frostbite. Around the bases he packed stone and lime mortar, ramming each layer until the posts stood as if they had grown there. Then came the bracing. Diagonal timbers crossed between the legs in a pattern the farmers found excessive and the bridgemen found familiar. Iron straps, forged by Elias himself, bit around the joints. The platform did not look like a homestead foundation. It looked like part of a railway bridge that had wandered into a meadow. Above it, Elias built a curved cradle out of heavy beams, cut and shimmed to match the belly of the boiler. He checked the fit again and again. He was not guessing at romance. He was distributing load. When Gideon Vale came to inspect the work, he did not bother pretending it was a friendly visit. He walked around the posts, kicked one boot against a brace, and looked up at the empty cradle. "Kevern," he said, "you have made a fine stand for something that should never stand there." Elias was sharpening a cold chisel on a footwheel. He let the stone slow before he answered. "It will stand. Against a calm day, maybe. Against a Chinook? Against a night wind off the pass? Gideon pointed toward the valley mouth. "You lift that much iron above the ground, and the wind will find it. It will work those joints until the whole thing twists. You cannot live inside a pendulum." Elias brushed filings from the chisel edge. "No," he said. "That is why I did not build one." It was the kind of answer that made the carpenter angrier, because it sounded less like ignorance than refusal. The lift took most of a day. Horses pulled through a double block. Men leaned on pry bars. The boiler crept up the timber ramp inch by inch, then hung for a breath at the lip of the platform, as if the whole hillside were waiting to see whether gravity would take offense. Then it settled into the cradle with a low iron boom. Nothing moved. Not the posts, not the braces, not the cylinder. Even Gideon Vale stopped speaking. For the next 3 weeks, Elias turned the shell into a home. He riveted plate over one end and cut a narrow doorway through the other. He made a small round window, then another on the opposite side, to draw light through the length of the room. Inside, he fastened wooden ribs to the steel, then packed the space with sheep's wool felt, dry sawdust sealed in cloth, and thin cork sheets salvaged from shipping crates. He did not trust one material to do all the work. The steel would stop wind and wet. The wool and cork would slow the heat. The air gap beneath would break the ground's grip entirely. The stove sat low in the center, bolted to a plate. The pipe rose from the crown of the cylinder through a gasketed collar Elias built like a steam joint, not a cabin stovepipe. Mara watched the room become stranger and more sensible at the same time. A narrow bunk for the children along one side, a folding table against the curve, shelves fitted into spaces no square cabin would have had. At night, lantern light rolled along the rounded walls and made the place feel less like a barrel than the inside of a ship. One evening, when the ladder was finished and the first cold stars had come out, Mara stood below with her shawl tight around her shoulders. "It looks as if it is waiting for a flood," she said. Elias looked at the dark shape above them. "Not a flood," he said. Then he looked at the hard, white ground. "Something slower." To understand why Elias was willing to endure the mockery, you have to understand the quiet cruelty of conduction. Conduction is heat moving through touch. Put a spoon in a hot pot and the handle warms because the metal gives heat a path. Put a cabin floor against frozen earth, and the warmth inside the cabin does the same thing in reverse. It walks away. Through plank, through joist, through stone, into the ground. A conventional frontier cabin could lose an astonishing amount of heat through the floor, especially when snow packed against the foundation and turned the whole base of the house into a cold reservoir. The stove might be doing honest work. The walls might be chinked tight, but if the floor remained tied to frozen mass, the home was never truly free of winter. Elias's idea was almost embarrassingly simple. Lift the living space high enough that the snow and frozen ground could not touch it. Let the wind pass under, but the drifts pass around. Make the cold cross open air before it could reach the floor. Still air is not perfect insulation, but compared with the direct bridge into frozen earth, it is a revolution. A 200-square-foot cabin floor pressed over cold ground might lose heat continuously, hour after hour, as if a hidden stove were running backward beneath it. Elias's raised iron room had no such bridge. Its floor cooled only to the air below, not to the buried winter itself. And the round shape did something a square room could not. The stove warmed the steel and the inner lining. Warm air rose, followed the curve, spread across the crown, cooled, then slid down the far side and returned along the floor. A slow wheel of air turned inside the cylinder. No cold corners, no dead pockets, no ceiling full of wasted heat while the children's feet froze below. The house was not just lifted, it circulated. It behaved like a machine built for warmth. Then the test came. In January of 1907, a hard northern outbreak dropped over the mountains and sat in the valley like an anvil. For 6 days, the temperature did not climb above 20 below zero. At night, it fell to 29 below. The wind came in long, steady pulls, not dramatic enough to make legends, but cruel enough to find every nail hole in a wall. Snow did not fall softly. It moved sideways. It planed ridges clean and packed leeward hollows until fences disappeared. Inside the ordinary cabins, families shrank into circles around their stoves. They shut off rooms with blankets. They slept in coats. They burned wood as if warmth could be bought by panic. At the Bell place, a crock of milk froze under a table. At the Vale house, the back door had to be chopped open from the inside because drifted snow pressed against it like masonry. Gideon himself spent half a morning digging out his woodshed, only to find the lower stack frozen into one solid block by thaw and refreeze. In the Kevern iron house, the storm sounded different. Not harmless, but distant. The wind did not pound the floor because the floor was above the wind's favorite path. Snow streamed under the structure and curled away through the braced legs. The iron shell shivered sometimes, the ladder rang, but the room held its heat. Mara kept the stove low, not roaring. Thomas and Ruth played checkers on the floor in socks. Their breath did not smoke, their fingers did not ache. And on the third morning of the freeze, the proof of the house was not a number and not an argument. It was dough. Mara had set a bread sponge near the little round window before bed. In every other cabin she knew, yeast was a gamble in weather like that. It sulked. It died. It became a sour, heavy paste. But inside the raised boiler, the sponge had lifted the cloth and spilled over the side of the bowl in a soft, living crown. While the valley froze hard enough to split fence rails, bread was rising 14 feet above the snow. That was the thing no insult could explain away. On the 7th morning, the wind died. The silence after it was so complete that men stepped outside just to hear whether the world still had edges. Gideon Vale climbed the ridge behind his property to check the tool shed he used for bridge timber. He found only the roof peak showing. The shed was buried nearly to the eaves, swallowed by a drift as high as a freight wagon. He stood there, exhausted before he had even begun digging, and looked across the white valley. That was when he saw the iron house. It should have looked ridiculous. Instead, it looked inevitable. The snow had piled under and around it, but not against the living room itself. The posts rose clean out of the drift. The black cylinder sat above the white field like a bridge span over a frozen river. From the stovepipe came a thin, steady thread of smoke. Not frantic smoke, not the heavy, choking smoke of a stove being overfed. A calm thread. Gideon stared at it for a long time. By noon, pride had lost to curiosity. He strapped on snowshoes and crossed the valley. The closer he came, the worse his old judgment looked.
There was no wall to shovel free, no foundation to clear, no snowbank sucking heat from the logs. Only a ladder rising to a small landing, and above it, the quiet sound of children talking. Gideon climbed. Halfway up, he felt the wind move beneath his boots, and realized with a carpenter's discomfort that the house was not fighting the air the way he had imagined. It was letting it go. At the top, he knocked once. The door opened before his hand had fully lowered. A slow wave of warmth touched his face. Not damp, not smoky, not the baked, suffocating heat of a cabin stove running too hard. It was even, dry, and gentle. For a moment, Gideon did not step in. He only stood there with frost on his beard, looking at the impossible domestic scene inside the iron cylinder. Ruth was sitting on the floor with a slate. Thomas was mending a wooden toy by the stove. Mara was turning a loaf out of a pan, its crust brown and cracked. Elias stood beside the table with a rag in one hand and a lamp part in the other. No one wore a coat. No blanket hung from the ceiling. No water pail sat frozen in the corner. The room did not feel like survival. It felt like a home that had declined to participate in the storm. Gideon looked down at the floorboards. He touched one with his gloved hand, then removed the glove and touched again. Warm. Not hot. Warm enough. That small fact did more damage to his certainty than any speech Elias could have given. He had mocked the height. He had feared the wind. He had measured the house as a structure and missed the enemy it had actually been built to defeat. The enemy was not above it. The enemy was below it. Gideon finally looked at Elias. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "You did not make a cabin." Elias waited. Gideon looked once more at the curved walls, the low stove, the bread on the table, and the snow moving harmlessly beneath the floor. "You made winter miss." The phrase traveled faster than Elias wanted it to. By spring, men who had laughed at the black cylinder were asking to see the drawings. Gideon Vale became the worst kind of convert, the kind with technical vocabulary and no shame about changing his mind. At the railway yard, he explained the thing to machinists, bridgemen, and farmers with a carpenter's bluntness. "The trick is not the iron," he said. "The trick is that nothing warm is touching the frozen ground." Still, the iron mattered. The railway had scrap boilers from logging engines and smaller locomotives that no longer justified repair. The shells were ugly, heavy, and hard to move, but they were weatherproof, fire-resistant, vermin-proof, and already shaped like rooms if a man knew how to finish them. That year, 7 families bought condemned shells. The next year, more followed. Not all were beautiful. Some looked like black barrels in the sky. Some were plated with shingles. Some had porches. Some used cedar, some tamarack, some heavy cribbing. But the principle stayed the same. Lift the room. Break the contact. Let the ground keep its cold. In the winter that followed, the reports were hard to ignore. Less wood burned, fewer frozen water pails, children who could sit on the floor, bread that rose when the valley sat below zero. One family in the high draw above Lolo kept a fuel tally out of suspicion and found they burned less than half their usual stack before March. Another family claimed their floor was warmer than the wall of their old cabin. The old builders did not all become believers. No practical idea ever wins that cleanly. Some called the boiler houses ugly. Some called them dangerous. Some said any family living in one had surrendered dignity to machinery. But the frontier had a way of stripping arguments down to results. If a house stayed warm on less wood, people noticed. If children stopped waking with frost on their blankets, people noticed. If a stove could idle through a night that made ordinary cabins groan, people noticed. What Elias Kevern had built was not magic. It was not prophecy. It was a tradesman's memory applied to a settler's misery. He knew that heat follows paths. He knew that metal, air, wool, wood, and earth each behaved differently. And he knew that tradition is sometimes just yesterday's solution surviving into a different problem. Years later, engineers would describe similar principles with cleaner language. Thermal bridging, air gaps, pile foundations, ventilated crawl spaces, buildings separated from hostile ground. In Arctic towns, homes would be lifted above permafrost so their warmth would not destroy the frozen earth beneath them. On coasts, houses would stand on stilts so storm water could pass below. Different dangers, same lesson. A house does not always become stronger by clinging harder to the ground. Sometimes it survives by knowing what not to touch. That was the genius hidden inside the ugly black cylinder on the Montana slope. Not that Elias made scrap iron into shelter. Not even that he proved the local experts wrong. The real genius was that he changed the battlefield. Everyone else tried to push more heat into a house that was still connected to winter. Elias removed the connection. He let the snow pile where it wanted. He let the wind run under the floor. He let the frozen ground keep all the cold it could hold. And then he built his family a room just beyond its reach.